YouTubers, Electric Adventures here with a special video celebrating the 30th anniversary of the MSX range of computers. Those of you familiar with my videos may know that I'm a particular fan of the MSX machines and also the machines that the MSX originated from, which are the original Spectravideo machines, because most of the software they wrote back in the days all came out for those machines, and it's the machine that I properly learnt how to program on and ran a magazine and all sorts of things. So it's started my path down the career of a computer programmer, which I still do to this day. So 30 years, it's quite a big milestone. Obviously other machines have celebrated as well. And technically, it's already been the 30th anniversary of the Spectravideos, where MSX all came from, and it's been an interesting development. It was, MSX was in the end Bill Gates and Nishi and Alex Weiss and Harry Fox from Spectravideo getting together. So basically, obviously, Bill Gates was into backing standards because he knew setting standards and standard platforms and capturing market. So he'd done PC-DOS or MS-DOS for the IBM machines in the business world, and the MSX was his bet on the home market and the Japanese. Spurred on by his friend Nishi, who ran ASCII in Japan and also represented Microsoft in Japan. And the two guys in Spectravideo, Alex Weiss and Harry Fox, were two Americans but based in Hong Kong. So their liaison with Microsoft was through Nishi of Japan. And that's all the arrangement there. And basically they had developed a design for a particular machine based around a Z80A, the TI-99 18A graphics processor, which is pretty much identical to the one that was in the TI, the main processor in the TI-99 series of machines from Texas Instruments themselves, and I'll have to put the model number of the music chip up here. I should have written it down, and a music chip from General Instruments, so their design. And they wanted a really good basic for it. So the Spectravideo guys got together with Microsoft, and they developed a new version of Microsoft Basic based on the Color Basic from the TRS-80 machines, and mixed with some of the features of their GW Basic from the 16-bit side of things, from the IBM PC. And that became the original Spectravideo Basic, with some very minor changes got rolled into the MSX standard. Pretty much what Spectravideo brought out as their original machine, which was officially launched in America at the very least in January at CES in 1983, and I believe I got mine around the same time, just after Christmas in 1983. They had the machine ready late in 1982, but obviously, there were, the original Spectravideo guys didn't have the money themselves, so that's why they partnered with other people to do the other things, and they were fully involved in the development of the MSX standard. But obviously the key driver was Nishi himself from ASCII. And everything in Japan takes a little bit of time. They're very clever, but it does, especially when you've got lots of companies talking together and doing a standard. So it wasn't until much later in the year, in July, that the actual MSX standard was announced by Microsoft, and which was earlier in July, I think June 14th, and then on June 27th the actual standard was launched in Japan. And then later on that year, quite late, almost close to Christmas, the first MSX machines were released in Japan itself. Spectravideo meanwhile obviously continued on with their standard machines, and unfortunately got a little bit tarnished because they were they originally were not saying they were MSX machines, because MSX wasn't around when it launched, but around the time of the MSX agreement they were saying their machines were MSX machines. But in the meantime, some slight technical changes have been made. They were good changes. The Spectravideo had a a game cartridge port on the top, which basically just had a data bus, and an expansion port on the back. The MSX standard changed it so it had 2 cartridge slots, both capable also as expansion slots, which made the machines very expandable, very flexible, and an enormous amount of devices have been made that plug into those expansion ports. Also, another advantage of working with Microsoft, they also developed a version of MS-DOS, MSX-DOS, for the machines as well, and it's fairly cross-compatible between the two, and there are a couple of different versions of that. And that's another advantage these machines had over other machines of the time. They had a strong disk operating system built into them. I mean, when the Spectre videos originally came out, and this is before the Microsoft had finished the MSX-DOS, they used CP/M. So obviously Digital Research was an early supporter of the Spectre video machines originally, and their original machines on 5 1/4 had very strong CP/M support. And it's actually one of the reasons why a large group formed around the original Spectre video here in Tasmania, because there was a very strong CP/M movement down here, and several of the fellows down here actually ran the Australian CP/M Club. So they went on and ran the Spectre Video Club of Tasmania, which then turned into the Spectre Video Club of Australia. And that's why, also I got hooked into it as well at the time. And the MSX standard, obviously it started in Japan because it was made by mostly by Japanese companies, and there were 14 of them originally. Names such as Canon, Hitachi, JVC, Mitsubishi, Sanyo, Sony, Toshiba, Casio, obviously Spectre Video, Gold Star, Yamaha, and Philips. Philips not being a Japanese brand, being a European brand. And there were a few other besides that as well that came along later. There are also offshoots of machines that were, because we gather this needs to be more historically researched, but Nishi was going around and selling the idea to everybody. So there are other offshoot machines like your Memotech MTX, your Sword M5, and even Sega themselves, who decided to not go into the MSX thing, and also released a machine early like Spectre Video in January 1983, which is the SC 3000 series of computers and the SG 1000 game console. And that's based off Spectre Video's original design, so it's still to be critically proven, which used a slightly different sound chip, the more limited one, one that doesn't have adjustable waveforms, and doesn't have as wide a frequency range as the end one chosen, and it's made by TI rather than General Instruments. And also another thing that needs to be nailed down in history is that Coleco were working on their own game console. It was delayed, and apparently they bought that original design of Spectre Video, and that's what Spectre Video used to seed some of the manufacturing of their machine. But that fact is yet to be totally proven yet. I mean, these were machines built around fairly common and easy to obtain components. The I/O chip in this Coleco is completely different to some of the other designs. That's why it's not totally straightforward to porting games from MSX and Spectre Video over to them. And the other, the MSX machines actually did quite well in Japan up until the release of the NES system, and the switch really from computers to a new era of consoles, which the MSX tried to compete with different versions, with MSX2 and MSX2 Plus, but always they were, because they were quite complex machines, rather than, and I said I'll point to it. There's a really good researched article by Tony Smith of The Register, which I'll link down to below. He's done a lot of really good research. He's spoken to Nishi. I'm sure he must have spoken to at least one of Alex Weiss or Harry Fox as well from Spectre Video. The information is very, very good and concise and thoroughly researched. So the computers launched in Japan. A lot of game development companies got into the MSX standard, because obviously if they developed it for that, it would work. They'd have a larger market share. That's what Nishi was selling them. So you have obviously iconic brand Konami, really heavily invested in the MSX system and invented a lot of game genres there. Metal Gear and Snatcher were programmed on the MSX first, and that's where those things started. Obviously, they ported their arcade games, Gradius and the Gradius series, over to the MSX, and the MSX versions are generally more detailed and have more of the arcade game in them than the ports for other systems. And around the MSX2 time, Vampire Killer, which is the MSX version of Castlevania, was released at the same time as the NES version, and is actually, once again, a more complex game than the original Castlevania for the NES. So the MSX has a lot of things, and that's just the Konami side of things. Then you have Compile with all their shooters. You have the Ease games as well, all came out on the MSX. Bomberman originated on the MSX. Also on the hardware front, obviously you had the cartridge slot, which was obviously more than just a ROM cartridge. Another big change they changed from Spectre Video to the MSX was they put in a full bank switching support. So an MSX could literally access quite, up to a megabyte of memory, which was a lot of memory, by using 16K banks. So you can actually get quite big. Actually, I think you can go up to 2 meg in the end by using the both memory channels, but it is, and some clever switching techniques. And Konami used some of these quite early. So this is Nemesis 2 or Gradius 2, and that's what an MSX cartridge looks like. Pretty standard, has the hole there and a little notch to make sure you can only put them in the one way. And this being a game cartridge, doesn't have every line plated through. Also, another piece of hardware that would go onto other systems was also introduced by Hudson Soft. So Hudson Soft got started on the MSX, and Hudson Soft later on formed a partnership with NEC and brought out the PC Engine. And they developed what they called the B card technology. So this is a B card. Sorry, slight cut there, but my daughter's actually going to make me lunch, so I won't refuse that. So, we're talking about the B card. So, B card was brought out for the MSX first. They didn't actually produce very many of them. There's actually only 9 of these cards, of which I luckily managed to get 4. There is a slight difference between a B card for an MSX and a PC Engine one. The PC Engine one has, I think, 2 more lines here, and they can be larger. But there's basically, at the end of the day, 2 ROM chips in there, all sandwiched in plastic, and they're cheaper to make than cartridges apparently, and that's the adapter you needed, because obviously it was not built into MSX machines. And the second use of this technology was obviously in the Sega Master System, but it was licensed from Hudson Soft. So, and obviously the other thing that MSX brought fairly early in the day by Sony was Sony had the 3.5-inch drive. And so, of course, the 3.5-inch disc came out by Sony's support of the MSX standard, and obviously then it got put into PCs as well. I mean, this is all pretty much simultaneous at the same time. So, and it's one of the reasons, I believe, why 3.5-inch won over 3-inch, and it's a beta VHS sort of battle. They both can store exactly the same amount of information on them. 3-inch discs were flippable, you could flip them over, but 3.5 counted that by having a drive that was actually double-sided without flipping. 3-inch discs are, I'd say, a little bit more robust and protected, but obviously probably a little bit more expensive to manufacture, and didn't have as many Japanese companies behind them, so 3.5-inch won by the number of machines they got out. So a lot of technological advances, and another thing that came out was eventually, after the first wave of machines, they came out with what's called the MSX engine chip, which combined, which was made by Yamaha. So Yamaha, obviously being a chip publisher, has actually probably come out the best out of MSX out of all of the suppliers, because they have chip production plant. And the MSX engine chip actually went on to be used in non-MSX devices as well, so maybe a toaster or a microwave out there has actually got an MSX inside it, but probably more than likely more home media devices and things like that. Also, Yamaha brought the MIDI standard out at the time of MSX, and their machines are the first wide adoption machine in the music industry for digital recording. And Yamaha obviously took their sound chip to the Atari ST and MIDI with it as well, so the Atari ST actually then took over from Yamaha in a lot of recording studios. Some recording studios haven't, in the last 10 years have kept those Atari STs going, so and only now switched over to PC or Macs. Yes, so in summary, obviously I'm very passionate about the MSX series of computers. I've owned several of them, and still, obviously built up my collection as I collect a bit of hardware now. I've built up in the past year or so. I've probably doubled what I had originally as far as MSX titles. A lot of my early MSX titles that I had were the tape-based games from the UK, because that's all I could afford. The cartridges back in the day when the computer came out were close to $100. Some of the Sony ones were cheaper, but I still don't think I ever owned any of those back in the day. I just couldn't afford them, so it was a big stretch to actually buy the computer in the first place. Around the time, now Australia did not formally get MSX2 at all. There were some direct imports of some MSX2 machines, mainly by Sony, and I'm struggling to remember the other brand. I'll have to check some of the old Spectre Video Club magazines, but I could never quite afford it, and in the end I ended up going and buying an Amiga. That broke down on me, so then I went and took that back, and then went and got an Atari ST. But I then still used my Atari ST as a and the desktop publishing client on it to publish the magazine for the MSX here in Australia for a couple of years after that. So I was still heavily into MSX for quite a while, and my Atari ST was sort of my home PC for quite a period of time, until I finally switched to actual PCs later on. So it's an interesting bit of history, and I suppose we're going to have quite a few machines. Will go through their 30th anniversaries. We've already had things like the Spectrum and the Commodore 64, and there's more to come. Most of the classic ones will go through their 30th anniversary over the next couple of years. So it's an interesting period, an interesting anniversary. So in closing, I'll probably do some more videos in the next week or so focused on MSX. I would actually like to do a hardware video where I'll go through each of my machines, all the way from the first Spectre Video up to an MSX 2 Plus, which is as new as I go. I did forget to mention there were 4 eras of MSX. There was MSX 1, MSX 2, MSX 2 Plus, and MSX Turbo R. Other than on the internet, I've never physically seen Turbo R. Maybe hope to own one sometime in the future, but it'd have to be imported, and they already sell for an impressively expensive price, and then you've got to worry about freighting them. So don't know whether I'll ever get one of those. Best I'll ever do is this MSX 2 Plus here that I've had for ages and now finally got working. But I also will probably do a video soon on my MSX software collection, because I'm quite proud of the titles that I've put together, and some good ones. So I'll probably put together a bit of a collection video interspersed with a few gameplay things to keep it interesting. And I'm also going to, now that the middle part of winter's over and it's starting to get a little bit warmer, obviously we'll still have some cold days yet, I'm going to be working on more of my exploring series, which I sort of started a while back and then got distracted by other things, so I'm going to get back into more of that. So thank you for watching this video and celebrating the MSX 30th anniversary with me. Thank you all my subscribers, and I'll catch you all later.